In a damp cellar, in the heart of a revolution, a 300-year-old dynasty, once the most powerful on Earth, met its end, not with ceremony, but with a volley of bullets. This is the story of the Romanovs. For 3 centuries, they built an empire that stretched across a continent and gathered a fortune worth billions today. This is also the story of how, in a perfect storm of war, betrayal, and chaos, it all came crashing down, leaving a legacy of both unparalleled greatness and unimaginable tragedy. How did one family climb to such extraordinary heights, only to be sent hurtling into the abyss? Their story isn't just history, it's a dark fairy tale of power, personality, and prophecy, where giants walked the earth right before the ground beneath them crumbled to dust. To understand the fall, you first have to understand the rise, and the rise of the Romanovs begins not in a palace, but in a pit of chaos. The year is 1613. Russia isn't an empire yet. It's a fractured, bleeding land tearing itself apart. This period is known, quite fittingly, as the Time of Troubles. The old ruling dynasty has died out, leaving a power vacuum so vast it sucked in foreign invaders and homegrown imposters. The Polish army holds Moscow. Pretenders are rallying armies, and the nation is on its knees, ravaged by famine, civil war, and anarchy. Russia needed a savior. What it got was a 16-year-old boy. His name was Mikhail Romanov. He wasn't a military genius or a political mastermind. He was a quiet, religious teenager hiding in a monastery with his mother. So why him? The answer is a mix of his family tree and his perceived weakness. The Romanovs were a prominent noble family, connected by marriage to the old dynasty, which gave them a shred of legitimacy. But more importantly, the warring nobles, the boyars, saw Mikhail as a pawn. They believed this shy, inexperienced boy would be a puppet they could easily control. They chose him not because they thought he'd be a great leader, but because they thought he wouldn't be one at all. When the National Assembly declared him Tsar, the delegation had to travel for weeks just to find him. They discovered him at the Ipatiev monastery, and when they offered him the crown, he and his mother wept and refused. The weight of a broken nation felt like too much to bear. But the delegates were desperate. They begged him, saying that to refuse was to condemn Russia to damnation. Finally, he gave in. In July 1613, Mikhail Romanov was crowned, and a new dynasty was born. Mikhail's reign wasn't glorious, but it was essential. Guided by his politically savvy father, who would become the head of the Russian Orthodox Church, he began the slow work of stitching Russia back together. He made peace with Sweden and Poland, clearing the land of foreign armies. He focused on restoring order, rebuilding the economy, and pulling power back to the throne. He even invited foreign experts to help build new industries, planting the seeds of Russia's future might. For most of the 17th century, Russia remained a vast, isolated, and largely medieval kingdom. While Western Europe was living through the Renaissance and the scientific revolution, Russia was a world apart. The early Romanovs brought stability and laid the foundation. They were the architects of the house, but they couldn't have imagined the giant who was about to kick the door down and rebuild it in his own image. How did this isolated kingdom transform into a global power? The answer came in the form of a man who was, himself, a force of nature. At the end of the 17th century, a new czar ascended the throne who was unlike any Russia had ever seen. His name was Peter, and he was a giant in every sense. Standing at a reported 6 feet 8 inches tall, his physical size was matched only by the scale of his ambition. Peter the Great didn't just want to rule Russia, he wanted to remake it. From a young age, Peter was obsessed with the West. He saw Western Europe as a hub of technology, culture, and power, and he looked at his own country with a kind of loving contempt. He was infuriated by its backwardness. In 1697, he embarked on a journey that would change Russian history: the Grand Embassy. Traveling undercover, the Tsar of Russia worked as a common shipwright in Holland and England, desperate to learn the secrets of their success. He studied shipbuilding, artillery, even anatomy, absorbing everything he could. When he returned, he brought the West with him, by force. Peter unleashed a storm of reforms that crashed over every part of Russian life. He knew Russia couldn't be great without a great military, so he introduced conscription, modernized the army, and out of thin air, built Russia's first ever navy. He streamlined the government, creating a more efficient, centralized state. But his revolution was also cultural. He declared war on old traditions. In a move that was both symbolic and shocking, he personally took scissors and started cutting the long, traditional beards of his nobles, which he saw as a relic of the past. He even slapped a beard tax on those who refused. He ordered his court to wear European clothes, reformed the calendar, and pushed Western social customs. This modernization came at a staggering human cost. Peter's grand projects were fueled by brutal taxes and forced labor. His new capital, St. Petersburg, is the ultimate monument to both his genius and his cruelty. He wanted a window to the West, a great port city connected to Europe. He chose a desolate swamp on the Baltic coast, territory he had just won from Sweden. Tens of thousands of serfs and prisoners were sent to build it. They dug canals by hand and laid foundations in the marsh, dying in droves from disease and exhaustion. The elegant city that rose from the mud was said to have been built on bones. Yet, it worked. When Peter took power, Russia was a peripheral state. By his death in 1725, it was the Russian Empire. He had defeated Sweden in the Great Northern War, securing Russia's dominance in the Baltic. He had established schools, a newspaper, and the Academy of Sciences. He dragged Russia, kicking and screaming, into the 18th century and put it on the world stage. Peter was a brutal, tyrannical, and visionary giant. He forged an empire with his bare hands, but his death left a power vacuum that would soon be filled by another colossal figure, one who would prove that greatness in the House of Romanov wasn't limited to men. Peter's death led to a shaky period, with a string of weak rulers struggling to fill his enormous shoes. But half a century later, the throne was seized by a woman who matched Peter's ambition and political skill, though she often hid her iron fist inside a velvet glove. Her name was Catherine, and she wasn't even Russian. Born a minor German princess, she was chosen to marry the next Tsar, Peter III. The marriage was a disaster. Her husband was immature and cruel, and Catherine felt isolated in the treacherous Russian court, but she was intelligent and fiercely ambitious. While her husband played with toy soldiers, she devoured books, mastered the Russian language, and quietly made powerful friends. In 1762, just 6 months after her husband became Tsar, Catherine staged a brilliant and bloodless coup. Peter III was forced to abdicate and was conveniently assassinated shortly after, leaving Catherine the absolute ruler of Russia. Catherine the Great, as she came to be known, presided over Russia's golden age. She saw herself as an enlightened despot, a ruler with absolute power who worked for the good of her people. She wrote letters to thinkers like Voltaire and Diderot and earned a reputation as a patron of arts and education. The world-famous Hermitage Museum began as her personal art collection. And like Peter, she was a relentless expansionist. Her armies won stunning victories against the Ottoman Empire, leading to the conquest of Crimea in 1783. This finally gave Russia a warm water port on the Black Sea, a strategic goal for generations. She also masterminded the partitioning of Poland, carving it up with Prussia and Austria, and absorbing huge new territories into her empire. But there was a dark contradiction at the heart of Catherine's enlightened reign. While she talked about liberty with French philosophers, she was tightening the chains on the Russian people. The Golden Age was golden only for the nobility. To fund her wars and lavish court, she strengthened the institution of serfdom. Rather than freeing people, her policies deepened the horrors of the system, and millions found themselves bound to the land as property. The brutal reality of her rule was exposed by the Pugachev Rebellion, a massive peasant uprising led by a Cossack, claiming to be her dead husband, Peter III. The rebellion tore across the country, a terrifying explosion of hatred from the common people. Catherine crushed it with merciless brutality, and any thoughts of liberal reform were quickly abandoned. Her long reign, ending in 1796, cemented Russia's status as a dominant power. She had expanded its borders and enriched its culture, but in doing so, she had also deepened the chasm between the tiny, privileged elite and the vast, impoverished masses. The glittering facade of her empire was built on a foundation that was beginning to rot. The story of the Romanovs is filled with these larger-than-life figures, but also with deep-seated problems that led to their ruin. If you're fascinated by this look at the complexities of power, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next video. The Golden Age glittered, but beneath the surface, the empire's foundations were cracking. The 19th century would see the Romanovs reach their peak, only to realize the world was changing faster than they could control. How did a dynasty of giants start producing men who couldn't see the coming storm? The century began with a moment of glory. Catherine's grandson, Alexander I, led Russia to its most iconic military victory, the defeat of Napoleon. Napoleon's disastrous invasion of Russia in 1812, his army wiped out by the brutal winter, became a national epic. When Russian troops marched into Paris in 1814, Alexander I was hailed as the savior of Europe. But even in this triumph, seeds of dissent were sown. Russian officers who marched across Europe saw a different way of life. Society societies without serfdom, with constitutions and freedoms. They brought home dangerous ideas. In December 1825, after Alexander's sudden death, a group of these officers, the Decembrists, launched a revolt in St. Petersburg, calling for a constitution. Their revolt was disorganized and quickly crushed by the new Tsar Nicholas I. He had 5 leaders executed and over 100 exiled to Siberia. The Decembrist revolt terrified Nicholas. He saw liberalism as a plague and spent his 30-year reign trying to quarantine Russia from it. He created a vast network of secret police, the infamous Third Section, to stamp out any opposition. He imposed crushing censorship and promoted a doctrine of orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality, demanding total loyalty to the Church, the Tsar, and Russia. He became known as the policeman of Europe, using his army to crush revolutions abroad. Nicholas believed he had frozen Russia in time. The Crimean War of the 1850s proved him catastrophically wrong. Russia went to war with Britain, France, and the Ottoman Empire and suffered a humiliating defeat. The war exposed Russia's backwardness. While the West had steamships and modern rifles, the Russian army was poorly equipped and badly led. Nicholas's rigid system hadn't preserved Russia's strength, it had caused it to stagnate. The shock of defeat fell on his son, Alexander II. He knew Russia had a choice: reform or revolution. He famously declared, "It was better to liberate the peasants from above than to wait for them to liberate themselves from below." In 1861, in the single most important reform in 19th century Russia, Alexander II abolished serfdom, freeing over 23 million people. He was hailed as the Tsar Liberator. But the emancipation was deeply flawed. The freed peasants didn't just get land, they had to buy it through redemption payments to the state that would last for nearly 50 years. The land they got was often too small to live on, leading to widespread poverty and resentment. The reform satisfied almost no one. Still, it kicked off a wave of other modernizing reforms. But for a growing number of radicals, it wasn't enough. They didn't want reform. They wanted revolution. Groups like the People's Will embraced terrorism, believing that assassinating the Tsar would spark an uprising. They hunted Alexander II relentlessly. After many failed attempts, in March 1881, a bomb thrower finally cornered the Tsar's carriage and killed him. The great reformer, the man who had done more to modernize Russia than anyone since Peter the Great, was murdered by revolutionaries. The assassination cast a long, dark shadow over the dynasty, leading to a new reign of fear and placing on the throne a final Tsar who was tragically unfit for the storm to come. The bomb that killed Alexander II also killed Russia's spirit of reform. His son, Alexander III, believed his father's liberal ideas had unleashed chaos and responded with brutal repression. When he died suddenly in 1894, the throne passed to his son, Nicholas II, the last Romanov Tsar. Nicholas II was, by all accounts, a good man, deeply religious, a devoted husband, and a loving father. His tragedy was being an absolute ruler who lacked the will and vision for the job. He inherited the belief that he was chosen by God, yet he was indecisive and easily overwhelmed. His reign began with a dark omen. During his coronation, a stampede killed over 2,300 people. Nicholas's decision to attend a ball that same evening created an image of callous indifference that would haunt him forever. His own misjudgments made a bad situation worse. In 1904, hoping a quick victory would boost his prestige, he led Russia into a war with Japan. The Russo-Japanese War was a national humiliation. Russia's army and navy were crushed, shattering the myth of its military might. The defeat triggered the revolution of 1905. It began on Bloody Sunday, when a priest led a peaceful procession of workers to the Winter Palace. They carried icons and portraits of the Tsar, their little father, wanting to deliver a petition. But nervous troops opened fire on the unarmed crowd, killing hundreds. The massacre shattered the sacred bond between the Tsar and his people. The country erupted in strikes and mutinies. Faced with total collapse, Nicholas reluctantly signed the October Manifesto, granting civil liberties and creating a parliament, the Duma. It seemed Russia might become a constitutional monarchy, but it was a false dawn. Nicholas despised the Duma, dissolved it whenever it challenged him, and clawed back the power he had given up. He learned nothing. This political crisis was tangled up with a deeply personal tragedy. Nicholas and his wife, Alexandra, had a terrible secret. Their only son and heir, Alexei, had hemophilia. Any small injury could kill him. The future of the dynasty rested on the fragile life of this one boy. Doctors were helpless, and this desperation opened the door to one of history's most infamous figures, Grigory Rasputin. Rasputin was a Siberian peasant, a wandering mystic and self-proclaimed holy man. He was brought to the palace as a healer. To everyone's astonishment, Rasputin's presence seemed to calm Alexei and stop his bleeding episodes. We still debate how he did it, perhaps hypnotism or Or maybe he just convinced the doctors to stop giving the boy aspirin, painkiller that's also a blood thinner. But for the desperate Serena, the reason didn't matter. She believed Rasputin was a saint sent by God to save her son and the dynasty. This gave Rasputin almost unlimited influence over Alexandra, and through her, the Tsar. Rumors swirled about the Mad Monk's scandalous behavior. To the Russian people suffering from poverty and war, Rasputin became the ultimate symbol of the court's corruption and incompetence. An unstable empire, a discredited monarchy, and a court paralyzed by a mystic. Into this powder keg, the world threw a match: the Great War. In 1914, Russia entered World War I. A brief wave of patriotism swept the nation. But the strain of total war would quickly prove to be more than the teetering regime could handle. The Russian army was enormous but disastrously ill-equipped. Soldiers were sent to the front without rifles, told to pick them up from the dead. They lacked boots, ammunition, and even food. The slaughter was unimaginable. In the first year alone, Russia suffered nearly 4 million casualties. In 1915, Nicholas II made a fatal error. He dismissed his commander-in-chief and decided to take personal command of the army himself. This act had two disastrous consequences. First, it personally tied the Tsar to every military defeat. Second, it left the government in the hands of his wife, the Tsarina Alexandra. And Alexandra, in turn, was under the complete influence of Rasputin. With the Tsar away, the government descended into chaos. Competent ministers were replaced by Rasputin's cronies in a bewildering ministerial leapfrog. The government simply stopped functioning. Meanwhile, the economy completely collapsed. Inflation spiraled out of control. Severe food and fuel shortages crippled the cities, and long bread lines became an explosive feature of daily life. While the court seemed lost in a haze of mysticism, the people starved. The empire was not just morally bankrupt, it was now financially ruined. In December 1916, a group of aristocrats, including the Tsar's own cousin, decided the only way to save the monarchy was to kill Rasputin. They lured him to a palace, fed him poisoned cakes and wine, and when that failed, they shot him multiple times before throwing his body in the river. It was a desperate act to save the dynasty, but it was far too little, too late. Rasputin had famously prophesied that if he were killed by nobles, the monarchy would fall within 2 years. With the mystic dead and the Tsar at the front, the capital was on the verge of explosion. The spark came in February 1917. It began not with politicians, but with women. On International Women's Day, thousands of female textile workers in Petrograd went on strike to protest the chronic shortage of bread. Their chants of "Give us bread" snowballed into a general strike that paralyzed the city. Nicholas, still at military headquarters, dismissed the reports as hooligan movements and sent his standard order: use force. But this time was different. The soldiers in the capital were weary of the war and sympathized with the crowds. When ordered to fire, they hesitated. Then, regiment after regiment mutinied and joined the revolution. Within days, the capital had fallen. The regime, which had stood for 304 years, simply evaporated. The Tsar tried to return by train, but his path was blocked. His generals and advisors gave him the same stark message. The situation was hopeless. The only way to save Russia was for him to abdicate. On March 15, 1917, in his royal train car stalled on a siding, Nicholas II renounced the throne for himself and his son. He offered the crown to his brother, but it was a poisoned chalice. Grand Duke Michael wisely declined, ending 3 centuries of Romanov rule. Power passed to a makeshift provisional government. Nicholas and his family, now simply the citizens Romanov, were placed under house arrest. Their cousin, King George V of Great Britain, initially offered them asylum but later took back the offer, fearing the presence of bloody Nicholas would spark unrest at home. There was no escape. As Russia grew more radical, their fate grew more precarious, leading them from their palace to imprisonment in Siberia, and finally to a merchant's house in Yekaterinburg, a place the Bolsheviks called the House of Special Purpose. And so we return to where our story began. In the early hours of July 17, 1918, the local Bolshevik commander Yakov Yurovsky awoke the Romanov family and their 4 remaining servants. He told them they were being moved to the basement for their own safety. Confused and tired, they dressed and were led down to a small, empty cellar. Nicholas carried his son, Alexei. Chairs were brought for the Tsarina and Alexei. As they waited for the trucks they thought were coming, Yurovsky entered with a squad of armed men. He quickly read out an execution order. Nicholas, stunned, could only stammer, "What?" before Yurovsky shot him at point-blank range. That was the signal. The others opened fire in a chaotic volley, the room filled with smoke and screams. When it cleared, the killing had been horribly botched. The daughters had sewn jewels into their corsets to hide the family's last wealth, and the gems had deflected some of the bullets. The girls were alive and wounded. Panicked, the executioners moved in and finished the job with bayonets and shots to the head. It was a gruesome, merciless end. In the following days, the assassins frantically tried to dispose of the bodies, burning them with acid and throwing the remains down a mine shaft. For decades, the Soviet government lied about their fate. The journey of the Romanovs is a sweeping epic from the time of troubles to the cold finality of that cellar. They inherited a broken nation and, through the sheer will of giants like Peter and Catherine, forged one of the most powerful empires on Earth. But their greatness was built on a flawed foundation. The autocracy that had been their strength became a fatal weakness. They failed to solve the deep injustices of poverty that plagued their people. They clung to an outdated way of ruling in a world being transformed by revolution. Nicholas II was a man ill-suited for his time, a ruler who loved his family but failed to understand his country, who made one catastrophic decision after another until there were none left to make. The brutal end of the Romanovs ushered in the rise of the Soviet Union. For most of the 20th century, their final resting place was a mystery, fueling myths that the youngest daughter, Anastasia, had somehow survived. The legend captivated the world, but in 1991, after the fall of the Soviet Union, a shallow grave was uncovered near Yekaterinburg. DNA testing confirmed the remains were the Tsar, Tsarina, and 3 of their daughters. Then, in 2007, a second grave was found, with the remains of Alexei and the final daughter. The family was complete. In 1998, 80 years after their murder, they were reburied with state honors in St. Petersburg, laid to rest alongside their ancestors. The myth had ended, but the story endures, a tragic testament to how a dynasty of giants can fall, and how an empire built to last forever can vanish into the dust of history. The fall of the Romanovs is one of history's great turning points. What do you think was their single biggest mistake? Was their fall inevitable? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and be sure to check out our next video for more stories of empires that rose and fell. Thanks for watching.